America was born in revolt against monarchy as well. And so they put in place a remarkable system. This is the republic that was designed to disperse power so it wouldn't be heavily concentrated, certainly not in one man. And they had what they called a cursus honorum, which meant a kind of stepping stone from one position to the next. If you wanted to become a consul someday, you were expected to serve in government in various positions before you became qualified. And I think if I were had to be a slave, let's say in 400 BC, I might prefer to be a slave in the Roman Republic than a slave in many other parts of the world.
Hello, Larry.
Hello, Jan. How are you?
Yeah, I'm very, very glad to see you and to may continue our talks about how to introduce young people to liberty and freedom issues. And as you remember, last time we talked about all set of directions how to do this, and especially our viewers were very interested in the fall of Rome issue, because it is not taught in schools. We talk about the empires, about rising empires, about the conquest of the empires, but so the fall of empires is let's say some kind of omitted subject. Okay, we prefer not to talk about this. However, you think that it's very important to the introduction to these issues of liberty and freedom. So could you enlighten us about this issue?
I would be happy to, and I appreciate the opportunity to do so very much. Roman history is full of important lessons that we can take and learn from today. Perhaps you are well aware of the famous line from the philosopher George Santayana, who said that those who ignore history are condemned to repeat it. And that's a very good reminder of the fact that history isn't just something that you should be occasionally interested in. You should, I think, want to learn from it, because there's an awful lot that's going on in the world today that isn't brand new, that has connections to or is related to events and ideas of the past. So it's with that in mind that I'm happy to share with you some thoughts about what transpired way back when. Rome began as, well, let me back up. I should take a step backwards and point out at the outset that Roman history is basically a 1,000-year period. And it's also conveniently divided almost right in the middle by the birth of Christ. The first 500 years roughly of Roman history is the period of the Roman Republic. And then that lasts until just a few decades before Christ. And then the second half of Roman history, ancient Roman history, is the period of the empire or the imperial autocracy. And that begins just before the birth of Christ and goes until about 476 AD, at least in the western part of the empire. The eastern portion, centered in Constantinople, will go on for yet another 1,000 years. So, but the empire and the republic that preceded it, headquartered in Rome, is a 1,000-year experience. Rome was begun as an independent entity when Romans revolted in 508 BC against kings. There were 7 kings in a row, and the last one was particularly bad, and that sparked a revolution in Rome. You know, in that sense, when I speak to an American audience, I like to point out that sounds familiar, doesn't it? America was born in revolt against monarchy as well. When the Romans threw off the yoke of monarchy, they really determined right from the start that they didn't want anything like that again. And so they put in place a remarkable system. This is the Republic that was designed to disperse power so it wouldn't be heavily concentrated, certainly not in one man. And they created a republic. And at the top of it, the two senior officials of the republic were called the consuls. And there were two of them, which is, again, evidence that Romans didn't want to see the concentration of power in one man's hands. So they said, we're going to have two guys at the top. They will be called consuls. They will be term limited. They only had 1 year. That's all they could serve. And the decisions of one could be vetoed by the other. So the two of them had to come to agreement to get anything done. And they both knew that they only had a year before they'd have to return to life in the private sector. They also, the Romans, created the body that we all know so well, the Roman Senate. And it was made up of people who could trace their ancestral lineage to the time of Romulus and Remus, which is like 750 BC. Romulus and Remus were the legendary co-founders of Rome as a city, way 200 plus years before this revolution in 508 BC. The Senate was made up of these families, sort of noble families with that noble blood, you might say. But that wasn't the only body that the early republic created for their governing institutions. They created popularly elected assemblies as well, which over time, in fact, will grow in influence and power as the influence of the Senate declines a little bit. And the democratic nature of the republic begins to broaden out to include more people. So it isn't just the nobles running the place rather quickly. But they also had magistrates, and they had what they called a cursus honorum, which meant a kind of stepping stone from one position to the next. If you wanted to become a consul someday, you were expected to serve in government in various positions before you became qualified. And the popularly elected assemblies eventually will create a position called the tribune, an elected position, which in power will rival that of the Senate. So over time, these things morph and evolve, and power is sort of jockeyed around a little bit. But the point is, Rome created a system of relatively reliable representative government, which was unheard of at the day, and also a degree of individual freedom that was unheard of. Rome at the early days of slaves,
a part of slaves. That's
right. Yeah, Rome did have slavery, always did.
Yeah.
And so this representative government really was intended to serve only those who were in it and or governed by it, not those who were enslaved by it. But in the Romans' favor, slavery was not peculiar to them. It was common the world over. It would be for centuries afterwards too. And I think if I were had to be a slave, let's say in 400 BC, I might prefer to be a slave in the Roman Republic than a slave in many other parts of the world, where both the standard of living and the degree of tyranny were very different. Rome had a constitution, but like the British, it was an unwritten constitution, but it was very powerful. It was something that bound the early Roman republicans together by consensus, by custom, by precedent, and it was not something to be trifled with. For instance, early Romans felt that, hey, if you were ever caught trying to violate the Constitution and make yourself like a king, then it would be legal for any Roman citizen to kill you. I mean, they just said, we don't want anything to do with concentrations of power and single man rule. So don't flout the Constitution or everybody's going to come after you. That held strong for several centuries. Now, the question is, okay, well, once they created this atmosphere of relative freedom and representative government with all the caveats of things like slavery for some and so forth, what happened? Well, Rome became the center of the world's wealth. This considerable degree of freedom was very productive for economics and material prosperity. Rome grew in influence and power because of the relative freedom that it had. And by the 4th or 3rd centuries BC, it was the wealthiest or the center of wealth in the Western world. And, you know, you could spend hours or days or weeks just talking about that period, but I think the most instructive period of ancient Rome involves when they lost those freedoms, when they lost their representative government. And the question is, how did they lose those things? I mean, once achieving these wonderful, unprecedented institutions and degree of freedom, how did they lose it all? And that's where I'd like to spend the balance of our time in the next 10 or 15 minutes focusing on. If you could point to a particular time and say that's when the decline really began, when it's really evident, it would be the 140s BC. So this means what, 400 years roughly after the Republic, about in the 140s. And I'll give you 3 reasons why the decline began and why it began about that time. One of the reasons for the decline of the Roman Republic is the rise of the welfare warfare state, where instead of thinking of the central government as the defender of rights and defender of the nation in a national defense way, Romans begin to discover, hey, it can do a lot more things for us. Instead of just keeping the peace, we can get things from it. We can vote ourselves a living instead of just voting for one. Instead of just working for one, I should say. We can vote ourselves a living instead of just working for it. And so in the 140s, you see the rise of politicians who begin to offer to the Roman people all kinds of favors and goodies. The Gracchus brothers, Tiberius and I forget the other's name, but their last name was Gracchus. Gaius. Back to back, they offer various land reforms and redistribution. They began the dole of grain subsidies to the Roman people. And some of it was well-intentioned. It wasn't just cynical politicians trying to buy votes. There was a serious effort by the Gracchus brothers to change the system whereby the wealthy could get special favors from the government in the form of land, but the not so politically connected sort of had to pay the price for it. So I'm a little sympathetic to the Gracchus brothers in part, but the downside is that they began to sow this idea that the government is more than just a keeper of the peace. It could be a grantor of favors and goodies and handouts and subsidies. That started in the 140s, and the welfare state continued to grow for decades thereafter. And it always does, unless people have a change of heart and a change of mind. One of the problems of every welfare state is, how do you keep it limited? I mean, if you start out saying, well, we'll just do a little bit of redistribution, we'll just give this one group, like the veterans or certain poor people, we'll give them something, and we'll keep it limited to that. Invariably, the problem becomes one of the politicians outbidding each other to buy more constituencies. They say
we have the same process nowadays in Poland, the same process. So the present government promised 500 zlotys, and the people who want to be elected in the future, they promise 1,000. Okay.
Yeah.
So it's,
exactly. That's exactly what was happening in ancient Rome, politicians outbidding each other. And you had amongst the people this gradually changing or shifting viewpoint on the role of government, so they began to accept it. And I'm sure you had people in ancient Rome who said, wait a minute, why do I have to be the guy who gets taxed for all these benefits, but I don't get anything? So I think I should get benefits too. And that's the way the welfare state grows. Everybody begins to say, it's not fair if I don't get something, so everybody gets something. And before long, it's like a big circle of people. Each one has his hands in the next guy's pocket.
Yeah.
You know, everybody thinks, oh, it's kind of free for me, but it really isn't, because they're picking your pocket for the benefits that everybody else gets. And that becomes financially unsustainable. And a crushing burden on the central government through the course of the 1st century BC. So that's the first reason for the decline of the republic, the growth of the welfare state. And I call it the welfare warfare state because the second reason for this decline focuses on that angle, and that is foreign adventurism. Thomas Madden, in his wonderful book called Empires of Trust, draws a lot of parallels between ancient Rome and American history. And he points out that early on in the Republic, whenever Rome went abroad to wage war, it was usually defensive in nature. There was even the remarkable example of where Greece was under pressure from the Persians, and the Romans sent troops to help the Greeks expel the Persians. And the Greeks expected that the Romans would just take them over and stay. And they were surprised when the Romans said, okay, we're glad to help you repel the Persians, but the job is done. We're going home now. You're on your own. But then later in the Republic, Romans got this idea of conquest. They thought, hey, you know, we can bring in a lot, especially since we're overtaxing our own people. We can bring in more revenue now if we just go take somebody else over and take their stuff. So you have this complicating, expensive factor of foreign adventures. So Romans going abroad for the purpose of conquest and bringing home the loot. And that creates a lot of, you know, the costs of empire become burdensome. When they go abroad, they often bring slaves back, and the rich guys get the slaves to work their plantations, and the individual farmers trying to compete with slave labor can't make it. So they go bonkers and become very angry with the system. It just creates an endless tension at home, as well as sky high costs. The third factor in the decline of the Republic are the constitutional compromises, or I should say, let's use compromises, in the service of the first two. Okay, what do I mean by that? As government grew for both reasons of welfare and warfare, you had pressures on the system for people to cut corners. As I mentioned earlier, the consuls were to serve one term, and that's it. But in time, with all this power centered increasingly in the state, nobody wants to give it up. And so you have consuls who say, oh, well, you know, I'm supposed to leave office this year, but you people really need me, and I'd like to kind of stick around. So let me have another year or two or three.
Just the same as Putin did.
Yeah, exactly. He would put Medvedev up in the other position, and they'd switch, and you know, everybody knew.
I think that the biggest invention was this system of consuls, that they have to be changed every year, and they represented the country as two guys. Yes. So the Swiss go even further because they represent, there were 7 people representing Switzerland. So it's a federal council, and this is the biggest invention because power corrupts, and we can see results nowadays with the president of Russia, which became insane and crazy.
Yeah, he's a walking case for term limits, isn't he? I mean, if Putin had served only 1 term or 2 and had to retire to the private sector, do you think he would have invaded Ukraine? I don't think so. No, after 20 years in power, near the top, he didn't want to give it up. He's just thinking of other things to get involved in. So that's the intoxicating influence of power. Has that terrible effect on just about everybody. So you had this erosion of respect for the Roman Constitution. Even ordinary people who used to respect it would say, oh, well, if this guy's going to give me something, I guess I'd like to keep him in office. keep the checks flowing, so to speak. And so the Constitution becomes almost a dead letter, like, oh, it's in our way. We want to do so many things. The Constitution won't let us do it. Let's just ignore it. And we see that in America today all the time, sadly. Well, every welfare state, and when it's accompanied especially by the erosion of the core governmental principles and institutions, leads inevitably to strife and to conflict. When government is small, it's hardly worth fighting over. If you really want to be successful in life, you probably have to find other things to do than government. But when it is confiscating so much wealth and redistributing it to so many people, lots of people want to be the government or be in charge of it, or at least get it off their back. So everybody's fighting each other to try to control this incredibly huge and growing redistributive apparatus. So Rome in the 1st century BC becomes the center of conflict and civil wars and factions fighting against factions. And instead of people thinking their first loyalty should be to the Constitution, their first loyalty increasingly goes to the general who will give me the most if he gets in power. Well, you can't have a free society when those values that created it in the first place are being thrown to the wind. And so one of the last great Roman defenders of the old republic was Cicero. And I know I need to wrap this up so we can go to questions, but I can hardly finish talking about the republic without talking about its greatest defender. Cicero was a man who saw these destructive forces taking place around him. This is late in the Roman Republic. He's born in 106 BC, so most of his life is in that last century of the Roman Republic, and he sees all this conflict and strife and this growth of government. And he's a very effective orator and lawyer. He holds just about every position that you can get elected to in Rome, all the way up to, in 63 BC, he's elected one of the 2 co-consuls. And it's in his consulship when there is a horrific crisis. A Roman senator named Catiline, as it turns out, is conniving with forces around the Republic to take power. He's conspiring to kill the 2 consuls, including Cicero, seize power and declare his own dictatorship that would snuff out the old republic in one fell swoop. Well, Cicero discovers this and leads the effort to stop it. And it leads to open warfare with the forces of Catiline, but fortunately he's defeated and Cicero is triumphant. He is appreciated by the Roman people so much that the Senate names him father of the country. And you'd think, here's a man at the pinnacle of his power. He had just been given extraordinary additional powers to fight the Catiline conspiracy. His term is only a few months away. Do you think he'll hold on to power? He probably could have if he really wanted to, but no. When his year is up, Cicero says, I'm in favor of the old retiring. He's sort
Sorry,
of
we have some interruption. You have to repeat because we have breaking sound. So what did Cicero said?
Okay, Cicero basically said at the end of his 1 year as consul that thank you for the opportunity you've given me for service, and now I am retiring, which is a great thing. He walked away from power in defense of the old virtues of the Republic. But he knew that it was all crumbling around him. And Julius Caesar, a few years later, will make his appearance on the scene and will force the Senate into naming him dictator for life. Some people say, well, that's when the Republic ended. But of course, Caesar was dictator only for 1 month because of his assassination. And the assassins were believers in the old republic. They wanted to restore it. And so there was still a chance that maybe the old liberties and values of the republic could be continued. But Mark Antony declares himself the new dictator in the wake of Caesar's assassination. And that's when Cicero comes out of retirement and he goes before the Senate and he gives a series of 14 speeches known to this day as the Philippics. You can still read them. In fact, the amazing thing about Cicero is that we know more about him and by him than any other human being who lived on this planet before 1000 AD. So many of his letters and speeches were transcribed and were saved. And he gives these 14 speeches in which he attacks Mark Antony. He says he's an enemy of the Republic. He will take our liberties, what we have left of them. He will take them all and make himself an all-powerful dictator. This must be stopped. Let's restore the old Republic and the freedoms that it guaranteed. Well, Mark Antony declares Cicero an enemy of the state for those speeches, and he dispatches an assassin to kill him. And in December of 43 BC, the assassin finds his mark, and with a sword, he decapitates Cicero. That, I think, is the moment when the Republic ended. Some people say, well, no, not quite yet, because the empire hasn't begun. Augustus, the first emperor, hasn't taken office yet. There's a period of civil strife until that issue is resolved. But I think, no, when Cicero was assassinated, that was the end. Why? Because there was no other courageous defender willing to speak truth to power at that time. Everybody was afraid of Mark Antony, afraid of the consequences of the civil war between him and Octavian. When that ended in 31 BC, it was clear that Octavian would become a strong man, and in 27 BC, he becomes the first of the Roman emperors. So certainly the Republic ends by then, if you don't think of it as ending with the death of Cicero. Well, then we've got 500 years of an imperial autocracy. The old institutions, in some ways, are still around. They never get rid of the Senate, but it doesn't really have much power. It pretty much has to do what the emperor tells it. And there were times when the Praetorian Guard, the armed soldiers around the emperor whose job was to protect him, they actually seized power. There's a moment, in fact, when the Praetorian Guard assassinates one emperor and puts the job up for public auction. And a man named Didius Julianus is the high bidder, so he gets to become the emperor. He simply buys his way into the job. It turned out, though, he didn't have the money to pay the Praetorian Guard what he promised, so about 3 months later, they kill him too. So you have this long series of bad emperors who come to power for all the wrong reasons, because they killed enough people or they bought the position. It's not the Rome of the old Republic. It's the Rome of a corrupt government, omnipotent government, centralized power. And the welfare state continues. In fact, even emperors will try to buy the support of their people by throwing all kinds of goodies at them. The Emperor Aurelian in 276 AD made the right to welfare hereditary, meaning that if your parents got payments from the government, you were entitled as a matter of right to receive them as well. And he added free salt and pork and olive oil to the subsidies that were principally grain up until that point. The process of centralization of power and tyranny and the welfare state continues to erode the Roman Empire, especially in its last 3 centuries, until by 476 AD, it's just a hollow shell. And that's the year when foreign barbarians invade Rome, take over the city. A Germanic chieftain by the name of Odoacer removes the last of the Roman emperors and declares himself the new authority. And that's the end of the Roman Empire. And some people make the mistake of saying, well, what killed off the empire were the barbarians. But I say, no. Rome did it to itself. This was a suicide. This was a national suicide. They had a good thing going in the old Roman Republic. They should have continued to work to advance personal liberties, but instead they changed their views of what the proper role of government is, began to almost worship it, And the result was the loss of liberties and ultimately the loss of the society itself. Rome had at one time 1 million people in it at its height. Guess how many people it sunk to in the Middle Ages? 17,000. So that tells you, you can't count on success to continue forever.
The degree of decline, yeah.
Yeah, it's remarkable. And you can't just assume that because your ancestors were free, that you and your children and their children will be free. It requires constant dedication to the principles of liberty. If you lose those, you'll eventually lose everything.
So I would like to compare what did you said to the book of John Glubb. He was a British general or colonel, and he died in 1970s, I suppose. And he compared the cycle. So he compared about 11 or 12 empires, the history of empires. Yes. And he came to the conclusion that the rise and the fall of empires repeats in a very well-defined pattern. So he said that the stages of the rise and fall of great nations seem to be the age of pioneers. So, the people very courageous, and they learn quickly by their mistakes, and they conquer. Mm-hmm. Then the age of conquest. So these people are conquering their neighbors. Then mm-hmm. the age of commerce, and the age of affluence, the age of intellect, and the age of decadence. Okay, so he defined precisely 6 stages and more. He said that all of this happens in 10 generations, in 10 subsequent generations. Okay, so for me, we have published his book. It became a Pafer's bestseller. There are people who are buying, 40 these books to spread around among their neighbors and acquaintance. Mm-hmm. So he said that the decadence, so the fall of empires, is due to too long period of wealth and power. So that wealth produce this misunderstanding of the system, and that we commit, so the society commits suicide.
Yeah.
And yes, also the loss of sense of duty. And according to this cycle of empire, we can predict that the United States will fall apart in 10 or 15 years.
Yeah, that's a chilling thought, but I certainly can see plenty of signs of it, and that would be within the time frame that he identified. If he said 10 generations, that's roughly 200 years. Yeah. It doesn't have to be that way. I wouldn't say that there's anything that's automatic or that says these things have to happen, because we are creatures of ideas.
Yeah.
And we can change our course if we change our thoughts, change our minds. And I know you believe that too, or you wouldn't be doing the good work you're doing at Fear. We're always trying to change minds so as to change the course of history in the right direction.
Yeah, thank you very much for this, let's say, next lesson, how to introduce youngsters to liberty and freedom issues. And what will be the next talk in 1 month? What you propose as a subject?
Oh, I should have I didn't know you were going to ask that, so I didn't give it much thought, but I know we'll come up with what could be. Well, how about some examples, other examples in history of surprisingly good little enclaves of freedom.
Okay, great.
That we can learn something from.
Perfect. Okay, thank you so much for this interesting talk, and we will see in 1 month. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Jan. Goodbye.
Okay.